My name is Michael Thompson. I'm the director of the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I want to thank the California Endowment for making this terrific space available today for this event. I'd like to start by just explaining a little bit about the Council of State Governments Justice Center. We are a national, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization serving all elected and appointed state government officials across the country. I direct the crime policy arm of the Council of State Governments, which is called the Justice Center, and we focus on data-driven, consensus-based strategies to increase public safety and strengthen communities. I want to recognize a couple of folks in the audience who are co-authors of the report that we put together today. First, Blake Norton, who directs our local government division, a former top official in the Boston Police Department, and Andy Barbie, who is a senior research manager who used to head up the research division for the Texas court system in Texas. I also want to recognize funders who made this possible. First, the Rosenberg Foundation, the Public Welfare Foundation, and the Pew Center on the States. It's thanks to contributions and their support and guidance that we were able to do this study. This is an unprecedented study that we're going to be talking about. We know about lots of recidivism studies done constantly across the country and here in California, but we know of no other published analysis looking across multiple metropolitan areas to determine to what extent people on probation and parole are driving arrest activity. And this is, it's not just the type of analysis that makes this study so unusual. What makes it really unique is that it was a true joint venture. First, it was led by local law enforcement. There are a number of police departments that are represented here today, and I want to, in particular, recognize the Los Angeles Police Department, the San Francisco Police Department, Redlands Police Department, and the Sacramento Police Department for their leadership in making this all possible. They, in turn, partnered with local probation, and so we were able to work with county probation departments in each of those 4 metropolitan areas, and they were instrumental in making this happen. And then it was a partnership in addition to the municipalities and then the counties with the state, and to that we are extremely grateful to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation and are very pleased that officials are here today from CDCR. A little bit of background on the study. First, and again, I want to put this in a national perspective because we really believe this is a study with national implications. First, across the United States, states are under extraordinary pressure to cut corrections spending. It's the second fastest growing budget item in state spending. The first is healthcare, but of course a huge part of healthcare spending is federal dollars. So when we look at state budget items that are exclusively state dollars, nothing has been growing quite like corrections. We refer to it as a Pac-Man in state budgets across the country. Ground zero for this conversation has been California, where not only has there been a lot of fiscal pressure to actually do something about the growing corrections system, but of course there's also been a lot of pressure from the federal courts. And the decline that's occurred here in the prison population, a drop of approximately 40,000 inmates over 5 years, is really stunning, especially when you consider that few states have a prison system where they are even incarcerating 40,000 people on any given day. So it's an order of magnitude that is really quite extraordinary. It was against this backdrop that local law enforcement leaders from across the country have been asking with increasing frequency, what is the impact that we essentially putting less emphasis on our state correction system is having on our local police departments? To what extent are people on probation, parole, and people under community supervision actually influencing and affecting arrest activity? And we're particularly grateful to the law enforcement leaders, again, of the 4 cities that I mentioned earlier, who stepped up a few years ago and said, let's do this study in our cities. Let's take a hard look at the data and see what we found. What we did is we looked at 2.5 million adult arrest, probation, and parole records over a 3.5-year period. We looked beginning in January 2008 and then looked all the way until April of 2011. Those dates are very important because, as you know, realignment here in California, which has been a key focal point for corrections policy, commenced implementation in October of 2011. So the findings that I'm going to walk you through really all apply to pre-realignment, although as you'll hear me and the other speakers discuss, we think that this study has enormous implications for realignment going forward. So what did we find? And I have some lovely charts here that I'm going to use to highlight some of the key findings. The first, again, to answer that fundamental question of how many people of all arrest activity, what percentage are people on probation or parole supervision? And looking at all adult arrests in these 4 metropolitan areas, we found that about 22%, 1 in 5 adult arrests was somebody who was on probation or parole at the time of supervision. What about, were they ever on probation or parole supervision. That was closer to 38%. But as you'll hear speakers discuss, for people in criminal justice circles where there's this perception that parolees and probationers are the one driving overwhelmingly arrest activities, I think this particular statistic surprised us in a number of regards. And again, you'll hear more speakers talk about that in a little bit. So we know that 1 in 5 adult arrests involve someone who is on probation or parole. Well, what kind of arrests? I want to point to this chart over here. And here is where we actually disaggregated the arrests. And we found that whereas 1 in 6 violent arrests involve someone on probation or parole, 1 in 3 drug arrests involve somebody on probation or parole. So really important to disaggregate further that arrest picture. We know, of course, understandably, that law enforcement and prosecutors are especially interested in those violent arrests. And again, interesting that 1 in 6 violent arrests involve someone on probation or parole, whereas 1 in 3 drug arrests involve somebody on probation or parole. The second thing we wanted to look at is that, crime is down across the country. Crime is down in California, looking over several years, and crime is down in the major metropolitan areas that we analyzed. And the question was, as arrests have gone down in each of these areas, has the arrest rate declined similarly for people on probation or parole, or has it been steeper, or maybe not so much in terms of overall arrest activity? And here you'll see, in fact, that 18% of arrests over this 3.5-year time period, overall arrests declined 18%. What about arrest rates for probationers? Well, arrest rates for probationers declined 26%, so a steeper decline than what we saw in terms of overall adult arrests. What about the decline in arrests for parolees? A 61% drop in arrest rates for parolees over that same time period. So arrests down overall in these 4 major metropolitan areas, but arrests down even more when we looked at probationers and parolees. And then next, we want to talk about recognizing that probation and parolees are not a monolithic population. This is a very heterogeneous population that needs to be further disaggregated. We wanted to look at these tools that are being used increasingly across the country, risk assessment tools, in order to predict the likelihood of somebody reoffending. And so we looked in particular at the risk assessment results that CDCR had collected to determine to what extent the risk assessment results for parolees was indicative of their arrest rates. And then we did the same thing with probationers. And what we found was very interesting in that when we looked at it on parole and we pulled that parole population apart, we found that the highest rearrest rates were among those people who were assessed at high risk of reoffense, the lowest rearrest rates among the people with the lowest risk scores. So that tells us that the risk assessment instrument was quite helpful and indicative of what was happening with the parolees. With the probationers, it was a more muddled picture. We didn't see necessarily the same kind of prediction. We did see in some counties, and you'll hear more about Chief Still from San Francisco, where the risk assessment results were particularly indicative of someone's likelihood of reoffense. But risk assessment tools are something that are being used across the country, being used here in California, and certainly something we see as a key tool going forward. So there are a number of interesting takeaways, I think, from the study. We've only highlighted just a couple of findings in a quite lengthy report and analysis. But what I want to do now is introduce a number of people who were involved in this study from different jurisdictions to discuss a little bit what they see as some of the key takeaways from the study and what they see as key steps going forward. So I'm going to introduce all of the speakers, and then they're going to follow one after the other. Our first speaker is going to be here in Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Police Department, Deputy Chief Kirk Albanese. He will be speaking first and talking about LAPD's perspective on these findings. Next, we're going to hear from the District Attorney from San Francisco, in fact, a member of our Board of Directors dating back to his time when he was Chief of Police in San Francisco. Third, we're going to hear from the Chief of the San Francisco Probation Department, a national leader in probation circles, Chief Wendy Still, the Chief of Adult Probation in San Francisco. Fourth, representing California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, we're going to hear from the Undersecretary for Operations, Terry Mcdonald. She'll be speaking after Chief Still. And then lastly, we'll be hearing from Rick Brazil, who was the Chief of Police in the Sacramento Police Department when this study was launched, recently retired, but remains the President of the California Peace Officer Association. So with that, I'll turn it over to Deputy Chief Albanese.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Los Angeles Police Chief Charlie Beck, I'd like to thank the Council of State Governments Justice Center for their research and report. the impact of probation and parole populations on arrests in 4 California cities. I'm going to talk obviously about Los Angeles, and when we speak about arrests in Los Angeles, we're speaking in terms of the report period, '08 through mid-2011, on average 28,000 Part 1 crime arrests per year in Los Angeles, and in terms of all arrests, 173,000 per year. So a lot of people arrested, and in terms of law enforcement, we believe, as many other professionals do in this business, that you won't arrest your way out of a crime problem. That arresting more people doesn't necessarily mean less crime, but our reality are those numbers that I spoke of. In terms of the population of probationers and parolees within Los Angeles, now since October of 2011 with realignment, and of course during the study pre-realignment, we have done some things to ensure accountability while working closely with probation. Post-realignment, we have in all 21 police stations in the city what we call a parolee compliance unit. There are 4 officers minimum and a supervisor, 156 personnel citywide, full-time dedicated to this function. Recognizing the report's findings, we still believe this is an important element of our overall process of reducing crime and protecting the community in terms of ensuring accountability, working with individuals on probation and parole in terms of hoping that they, and working to allow them to get those services necessary so that they can reintegrate back into the community, back into society. In terms of funding, that funding that has come to Los Angeles County, it is our intention to use it in terms of enforcement, suppression, and again, in terms of keeping those parolee compliance units functioning at a level that we need to have them function at. Crime, at the end of the day for us, it's about the reduction of crime. And we've reduced crime in Los Angeles 10 years in a row now. During the study period, '08 to mid-2011, Part 1 crime reduced in Los Angeles 18%. Gang crime reduced in Los Angeles 30% during the study period. The issue for us is, as it relates to the study, Chief welcomes it. We want to embrace it in terms of a greater understanding of the data. We encourage additional work in this regard to further hone in on the things that are going to be important to us as it relates to our ability to reduce crime and understand the populations that we deal with. Information sharing, data sharing, the ability of personnel at the line level having access to the kind of information that will help them do their jobs of critical importance for us. And at the end of the day, a greater understanding of the populations that we deal with, in this case, probationers and parolees. So on behalf of the Chief, our thanks again to the Council of State Governments Justice Center for their report, for their work, for their research, and we hope to see it continue in terms of further analysis as it relates to this subject so we can be more effective in our communities. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the Council of State Governments for Justice Center for wonderful work in the study, and specifically Mike and Blake, as well as the other partners here. I know that when we embarked in this journey back in 2009, we really did not know where we were going. We knew certainly that we wanted to have a better understanding of the work that we did, and this was an effort to do so. But quite frankly, this was one of those things where the participants fully opened the doors without any limitations, and quite frankly, not knowing what the results were going to be. And I have to say, standing here today, that I'm very proud of the work that was done here. I think this is a seminal piece of work for the criminal justice system. I'm an LAPD alumni. I spent most of my life right here in LA until I moved to the Bay Area. I was the chief of police there and the district attorney there. I am a true law enforcement person inside and out. But I believe that part of fulfilling our responsibility as the shepherds of public safety is that we have to learn and we have to grow. And I think that there's some important information coming out of the study that we really have to look at very closely, because as resources are being reduced, and they're being reduced across the board, we have to make sure that what we have available to us can be as impactful as we can make it. And one of the areas here is that we need to look at this information and take it back to our own shops and figure out how we're going to do business, what part of what we're doing today we will continue to do, and what parts we're going to do differently. And you know, I want to underline all this by saying that we're still going to pay attention to people that are under supervision. I don't believe that that is mutually exclusive from dealing with other people that are not. But I think that there's some really important information that comes out of the study. When we're talking about roughly 62% of everyone that was arrested in these 4 cities during a pretty lengthy period of time had never been under supervision. I think it's important to take note and figure out what are we going to do with those folks so that hopefully they will not come back into the system, because we know that the other 38%, those that are under supervision, have been in and out of the system over and over again. So while there is a need to focus in that 38%, and certainly the way to deal with those folks may be different than the other 62%, I think that we have to be able to distinguish both. For me also, I think that from a prosecutor's point of view, we need to begin to look at a prosecution in a much broader sense. I believe that we have a responsibility to look at prosecutions not only as a one case at a time process where we're seeking a conviction, but we have to be much more broader in the way that we look at our prosecutions, and we really need to have a reentry plan before we even walk into the courtroom. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about using this data, and data that I hope that we will continue to develop in the future, so that when people are coming out of an institution, whether it's a local jail or a prison, part of the deal that was structured early on will take into consideration that these people are going to come back to our community and that we apply the right level of supervision in order to reduce recidivism. In conclusion, I believe that this report is a great piece of work, and I think that we in public safety, whether you're a police officer, you're in probation, you're a prosecutor, or in corrections, I think it's a great piece of work to learn from it, to continue to move the profession forward. I think it can inform our decision-making process in many areas. So I'm very thankful for the work, and I look forward to continuing this work. Thank you.
Hi, Wendy Steele, Chief Adult Probation Officer, San Francisco. The success of realignment is largely due to probation departments across the state being able to successfully supervise a larger population number. To do that effectively and within the resources that we have available, it's really important that we implement a system of triage, and we use risk and needs assessment as an opportunity to be able to target those very limited resources that we have right now to those highest risk clients. And that helps us to focus our efforts and resources, and that delivers the results that the study has shown. I also would like to thank the Council, State Government Justice Center for the timing of this study, because at a time where probation departments across the state are really taking on this new population, we have data, and it helps us define what our strategies are going to be and how we basically realign the dollars and the population in order to reduce improve the outcomes and reduce recidivism, because our goal is not just to reduce recidivism for the individual client that we're supervising. Our goal is to break the cycle of crime, and by using a science-based approach where we look and utilize the return on investment with our partners, then we can make better decisions and have better outcomes, and that's what this study provides us the data to do so. During this period of the study, total arrests across the 4 jurisdictions fell by 18%, which means that crime seems to be going down overall. Yet during this same time period, arrests involving individuals on probation fell by 26%, nearly 50% faster decline than the total average, and this wasn't by chance. During this period of time, probation departments across the state also implemented evidence-based practice supervision as a result of SB 678, and by doing so, we basically provided the legislature with the confidence to go to the next steps of realignment, because we reduced in a single year 6,000 probation violators going to state prison. So we know the science, and we know that the approach works. This also tells me that probation can do things right if they're adequately funded. We have probation departments across the state that have basically have caseload sizes that are too massive, too large to really implement evidence-based practice as it's intended to do, which means those public safety partnerships across the state need to look at the resources they have, and they need to retool them. And instead of focusing solely on beds in jail and incapacitation, really look at those alternative strategies. And data such as this allows us the opportunity to do so. The probation agencies have been using this risk-based approach in their supervision, and this report really illustrates just how powerful that information can be, and if we use the data and the science, that we will have better outcomes. So again, I thank the council for this report and all those funders that made the report happen, and I look forward to the next phase of it, where we can look now post-realignment and what is the data telling us to further help us implement effective strategies across the state. Thank you. I'd also like to introduce Terry Mcdonald, the Undersecretary of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation.
Thank you, Wendy. Good afternoon. I may be repetitive to say that we want to thank the council, but really, I think a huge thanks also goes to the police chiefs. It requires incredible leadership, incredible visionary thinking to have an assumption and have the courage to say, let's look at that assumption and see whether or not it holds true. I think most people would have stated before this report came out that parolees and probationers were the primary cause of crime in the communities. At least for these 4 cities, that doesn't turn out to be the case. Although it does inform us in other areas. It informs us of the importance of having validated risk assessment tools, which is very important. You'll also see the parole population arrests go down, and you may think, well, that's a fluke or that's unusual. It's really not. The California Department of Corrections began to use validated risk assessment tools coupled with a program called the Parole Violator Decision-Making Instrument. Because as the Assistant Chief so succinctly said, is you cannot use a jail bed for every problem you have. And finding alternative sanctions to incarceration actually is demonstrated in the parole reductions. But finally, it also reinforms the importance of us focusing on substance abuse treatment of offenders in state prison. That it's important that we identify them early, we get them into substance abuse treatment, and then we follow up when they go in the community. The most important thing that law enforcement leaders, criminal justice leaders can do is to work together. The most important thing that we can do is not work in silos or not work from assumptions, but deal with facts. And certainly the chiefs were fortuitous in turning to the Council of State Government. They're nationally renowned experts in this area. The report is important, and we look forward to working together on more reports in the future. Kudos to the team that did this.
Good afternoon, Rick Brazil. I'm kind of wearing multiple hats, retired police chief, president of CPOA, and executive fellow for the Police Foundation. So you might wonder, kind of in summary, why would 4 police chiefs get a hold of the Council of State Governments Justice Center and say, we want to find out who's driving crime? Well, in California, with a significant reduction in budgets, we had to get smarter. And as a police chief, when in talking with Michael and with Blake and Andy, the goal was to basically say, I would like to, as a police chief, be able to predict who's most likely to commit crimes in my community. And with limited resources, target that individual for programs, prevention programs, and/or incarceration. But we need to find out who the drivers of crime are, and the Justice Center basically said, we're in. Let's figure out how we do this in the study. So then how do you take 4 jurisdictions, and within 4 jurisdictions you've got multiple components as we discussed. It's not just 4 police departments. It's 4 probation departments and 4 sheriff's departments with data, and then include CDCR. Monumental task at least in the process, not just the 2.5 million records that were looked at, but how do you get those jurisdictions with different databases, different languages that we speak within those organizations to open up the doors and say, look at our data. It shows how much collaboration is important and how we solve problems within our communities, because it was a great effort by all the agencies, and I congratulate all of those that were involved in the process for opening basically the books to see what happened. But now where do we go? We talked about what the data says, but what's next? There's 5 recommendations in the report that all of us strongly support. The first is we need a validated risk assessment tool as illustrated here. When you look at CDCR's data and how they accurately predict, for the most part, who's most likely to commit crimes, therefore we focus our resources. Then you look at Chief Still in San Francisco and how successful they are in their assessment tool, and then how in other jurisdictions we're not quite as successful. It definitely drives home the need to have a validated risk assessment tool that's statewide. We need to improve data sharing. Just the project itself, trying to pull all the data together, was a monumental task within 4 jurisdictions. Wouldn't it be great to have an officer or deputy on the street be able to pull up the assessment tools to find out who is most likely in my beat or my district to reoffend? And then what can we do to assist in keeping them out of trouble and out of jail to begin with? We need to use evidence-based programs, much like George Gascon mentioned, DA Gascon mentioned. How do we take, and not just before we even enter the courtroom, how do we anticipate what's going to be needed by the defendant long before we ever prosecute them, convict them, and send them off to jail? How do we deal with that? We need to continue with looking at the data. We have a great benchmark for realignment. Let's use the benchmark, now study what happens post-realignment to find out in basic real time what's successful in California and what needs help. Where are we failing and how do we fix those problems? And lastly, we need statewide capacity. These are 4 jurisdictions, ranging in size from 75,000 up into the close to 4 million people in the region. So how do we universalize this across all 58 counties, big and small, so that California basically is leading the way for the rest of the country in dealing with data such as this problem with this? What you've seen is it's a new era, progressive collaboration amongst not just law enforcement agencies, but probation departments and the California Department of Corrections. So kudos to everyone there. And with that, we can start building really strong evidence-based programs that really keep people out of jail to begin with. And so we solve problems through not just incarcerating people, but identifying programs that keep them out of jail to begin with. And with that, I turn the podium back over to Michael Thompson for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Chief Brazil, and thank you to each of our speakers today. And again, I want to thank the leadership from Redlands, from San Francisco, from Sacramento, from Los Angeles for making this possible, and as was said, providing a foundation now for state government to be continuing to work in partnership with local government to really make sure that the future decisions about how best to make the public safe are indeed data-driven and make the best use of available resources. And so with that, we'll take any questions that folks may have online or here.
One question, how do partners see the local agencies using this data?
So I'm going to turn over to a couple of our local folks here. Chief Still, I don't know if you want to mention this first, and Chief Brazil again on behalf of the Police Chiefs Association, but again, a question of how to use this data, and I think one key issue for us is actually using this data as a baseline going forward to measure the continued impact of realignment. So Chief Brazil, you want to start with that?
One of the important things to realize is in law enforcement, just the correction system itself, we're very data rich. We've got a lot of data. Everything is automated. So as from a law enforcement perspective, from a chief's perspective or a sheriff's perspective, being able to target folks who are most likely to reoffend, to do simple things, home visits, for example. When you're constantly a beat officer's knocking on someone's door who's either on supervised parole or probation to say, how you doing? Are you staying out of trouble? How can we help you? Reinforces that we are paying attention, and again, we're paying attention to those that are most likely to reoffend. Because if you look back at the assessment tools, when used properly, are fairly accurate. So if we can get that to the beat officers in the street, the beat deputies out there and saying, hey, we want you to go visit so-and-so, Rick Brazil's house, for example, because he's on the list of most likely to reoffend for whatever the crime happens to be. Could be DUI, drunk driving. It could be violent crimes, could be property crimes. Just that constant positive reinforcement that we're here to help, and if not, there's consequences for your behavior. It becomes a very good tool, especially in declining budgets.
I think the value of the study, too, is, the myth busting that it's done, so that the partners in the local jurisdiction can really focus on that it's not all of probation or parole, that there's this larger, greater mass, greater percentage, and they can target their resources. But then for those, like in San Francisco, our results were that our risk assessment tool was highly predictive. That means that we're nailing it. We know who is basically likely to reoffend, and as we have these special operations and frets that we can, as Chief Brazil described, we can target those high-risk offenders and different supervision strategies, as well as know what they're being arrested for. So also, there are service dollars that we have, we can target those areas. So it helps us create basically more effective law enforcement strategies, not focused just on arresting, focused on other alternatives. And I think that's the value of this, and I think post the next phase of it, post-realignment will even provide us richer data. But we're very thankful for the council's report.
Thank you, Chief. Other questions? Yes.
I think a couple of folks talked about reentry and reintegration of offender strategies, and I'd be interested to just hear some of the thinking around how the data, and maybe in particular the greater prevalence of substance abuse arrests, how generally this data help informs reentry or reintegration strategies.
No, I'm glad you asked, because I think, again, one of the really interesting takeaways here was that when we disaggregated the arrest pool, where we saw the concentration were in those drug arrests. And so the question, what are we doing to really break the bonds of addiction for this population and help them get on with their lives safely in the community? And I know that the conversation nationally in corrections, working in partnership with community corrections, has been how do we make sure that we're not just doing intensive monitoring, but coupling that with the right kind of supervision, and that when there is relapse, that there's an immediate response, that it's swift, that it's certain, and that it's not necessarily the severity of the sanction, but rather that there is one, and the person knows that it's coming, and that there's an immediate response. But I know that Undersecretary Mcdonald has made this a huge priority for the parole department here in California. And Undersecretary Mcdonald, anything you'd like to add on that point?
Well, I think you've essentially hit the nail on the head. You know, reentry begins at intake. And part of intake is using a risk and needs assessment tool where you're identifying the needs of offenders when they come in the door. And if they have a high risk for reoffense based on substance abuse, then you deal with that on the front end. And then you also recognize that on reentry, that you have a reentry risk and needs assessment tool as well. This is relatively new thinking in the organization. We're using a validated tool to do that, and it's common across probation and state correctional agencies nationally. And I think, frankly, we're only going to get better as the tools are validated and improved in their outcome finding, as well as we learn from our own research what works and doesn't. For example, in our last recidivism report, we know that people with a substance abuse problem, if they are placed in a substance abuse program in prison, followed by aftercare substance abuse, their recidivism rate is cut in half. We wouldn't know that but for the tool coming in the front door, planning for their reentry when we get them in the door, and then following up with aftercare upon release.
Thanks, Undersecretary.
Just a quick question. How did you choose these 4 jurisdictions?
So we chose these 4 jurisdictions first because the leaders of those police departments really stepped forward and said this is something that they wanted to support. And again, we have Chief Brazil, then Chief Gascon, Chief Beck, and Chief Bierman, who were the chiefs of police at that time. And then we were grateful to the leadership that succeeded those chiefs after they left in a few of those places to continue their support for the study. So that was one reason. And the second reason is that while there's no perfect cross-section of jurisdictions in California, we recognize that if you've seen one city or county in California, you've seen one city or county, that we actually needed some sort of cross-section. And I think that these 4 jurisdictions represented a good, healthy cross-section of jurisdictions across the state. So those were the 2 primary reasons that we ended up partnering with these 4 places in particular.
And then also, what can be done to prevent crime for those not under supervision?
So I know that was a question that's been asked earlier about how we target resources and look at those particular places and those particular people that are most likely to commit crime. And I know Deputy Chief Albanese, this is something that you've talked a lot about in terms of using data. Would you like to answer this question, please?
You know, the issue of as I spoke about the Parolee compliance units, it may sound like a considerable resource, but in terms of the entire breadth of the department, it's a group of specialists that we've given a special function to perform. In terms of our CompStat process, we look at persons, places. Who asked the question, by the way? I had my back to you. Was it you that spoke, though?
Yes.
Okay. We look at persons, places, and activities. Persons, parolees and probationers are persons, but there are many others, too, that contribute to crime. So understanding those individuals that contribute to crime, places, we map our crime, we understand where patterns occur, we focus on those places as a matter of our daily enforcement effort. And in terms of activities that generate crime, for example, a party where gang members are present, we know from our experience that that's likely to generate crime. So in terms of the CompStat model, persons, places, and activities, in terms of our ability to address and reduce crime.
Pio Lopez from Sacramento Bee would like to know what's driving the fact that 1 in 3 arrests for drug crime involve someone on probation or parole, and what can be done to reduce that?
So, Chief Brazil, given the Sacramento nature of that, I'll turn to you. But again, the question about why, in particular, we're seeing this concentration in this population in the drug arrest pool. Sure.
As the report mentioned, one of the potential indicators, and there's no absolutes on this one, this just gave us kind of an idea to look at with more in-depth questioning, is that parole and probationers are unsearchable, have searchable conditions. So that allows police officers and sheriff's deputies to basically get into the homes, get in the cars, get in the pockets of these folks. You're more likely to find drugs or narcotics when you have that ability, that freedom. Where if it's just someone walking down the street and you don't have that probable cause, you're not finding narcotics where you might find them on a probation or parolee. One attribute as well, and you'll find that in CDCR system or any correction system of any jail, is a lot of folks who are offenders are substance abusers, whether it's alcohol or drugs. And so that population in amongst itself of probation or parolees has a higher percentage of substance abuse than the general population. So you're going to see those numbers as well. And there's a whole bunch of, a multitude of other reasons why, but those are the two basics.
Terrific. I want to thank again each of our speakers for coming here to the endowment today and sharing their perspectives on the report. I want to thank the 4 cities and counties that were such terrific partners in this study, and I want to thank CDCR, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, for making this a true joint venture with state and local government. And again, I want to thank our funders, without whom this wouldn't have been possible. Not only the resources, but lots of good comments about how to make this a better and more useful report. To the Rosenberg Foundation, to the Public Welfare Foundation, to the Pew Center on the States, thank you very, very much. And thanks again, all of you. And for those of you interested in learning more about the report, please visit the Justice Center website. That's justicecenter.csg.org. Thanks again.